My name is Remy Carter. I'm 38 years old, living in Seattle, working at a major hospital, and I'm the mother of a 9-year-old boy with mild cerebral palsy named Ethan. That morning, I stepped into the living room and saw my husband, Blake, hastily stuffing papers and clothes into a bag, his eyes never once meeting mine. He slung the bag over his shoulder and walked out without a word. By that afternoon, I discovered that the entire $150,000 from our son's treatment trust fund had vanished, along with my life savings. And then a casual remark from Ethan revealed everything. "Dad's going to Florida with the blonde lady, right, Mom?" Have you ever had a moment when something your child said made your heart stop? Leave a comment, hit like, and subscribe so I can tell you the whole story, from that brutal betrayal to how I turned everything around. Blake and I had been together for 14 years, long enough for me to believe I understood every glance, every breath of this man. We went through our most stressful days when Ethan was born nearly 2 months early, his tiny body fighting through a series of complications. The doctors diagnosed him with mild cerebral palsy, requiring ongoing monitoring and therapy. When Ethan turned 1, Blake and I signed the paperwork to open a trust fund. It was a decision we didn't even have to think about, because for our son, every therapy session, every piece of supportive equipment could make a difference. Every month, we contributed a portion of our income to the fund, treating it as untouchable. I remember Blake holding the account book, smiling. "No matter what happens, this will always be safe for our son." But now, that promise echoed in my head like a distant, bitter memory. Blake worked as a construction site supervisor for a major company. The job kept him busy but provided enough for everything, from the mortgage and Ethan's therapy costs to short summer trips to the beach. He used to proudly tell friends, "Remy takes care of things at home, I take care of things out there. We each have our role and that's enough." Then about a year ago, Blake began to change. At first, it was a few late-night calls, unexpected business trips he said came up without notice. When I asked, he laughed it off, saying the construction industry was cutthroat and that if you weren't flexible, you'd lose clients. What caught my attention most was how he handled his phone. He always placed it face down, even when charging, with the screen toward the wall. Incoming texts were skimmed quickly before he slipped the phone into his pocket. If I happened to walk by, his hand would tighten around it instinctively. One night, as I was folding Ethan's clothes, Blake walked in. "I have to go to Portland for 3 days this week, urgent project." I looked up. "Again? I thought you were just in Tacoma last week." "Yeah, but this is a new contract. If I don't go, we'll lose it." His tone was flat, his eyes evasive. I wanted to ask more, but Ethan called from the other room, excitedly sharing that his therapist had praised his progress. I let the conversation with Blake drop, telling myself he was under a lot of pressure. But his trips became more frequent. Sometimes he left early in the morning and came home after I was asleep. On nights when I woke in the middle of the night, the bed beside me was still empty. The next morning, he'd say he slept at the site office for convenience. One late autumn afternoon, when I took Ethan to physical therapy, the therapist quietly asked, "Blake hasn't been bringing Ethan in lately, has he?" I forced a smile. "He's busy with a new project." But inside, unease crept in. Blake had always been there for every milestone in Ethan's therapy until now. Once, while cleaning out the coat closet, my hand brushed against a receipt from an upscale downtown restaurant. The date matched the night Blake claimed he'd stayed at the site. When I asked him, he froze briefly, then smiled. "That was a client dinner, company paid." "Then why were there 2 identical desserts?" I blurted out. He was silent for a few seconds before snapping. "Remy, what exactly are you accusing me of?" His question made me falter. I quickly apologized, but the suspicion inside me began to grow, smoldering like embers under ash. I tried to reason away every strange sign. Maybe he was stressed from financial pressure, with Ethan's treatment costs increasing. Maybe he wanted to shoulder it alone so I wouldn't worry. But sometimes, in the quietest moments, another thought would flash through my mind. A thought I quickly pushed away because it felt too cruel. What if things weren't what I thought? One Saturday evening while I was cooking dinner, Blake got a call. He hurried out to the balcony, sliding the door shut. His voice grew faint, but there was a sharp urgency in it. I caught only fragments. "Can't withdraw now, wait until she's asleep." When he came back in, I asked who it was. Blake answered immediately. "A client in Portland. They want to change the timeline." I nodded, but in my mind the fog had started to thin, revealing something darker. I wasn't ready to touch the truth yet, but instinct told me it would come soon, and it wouldn't be anything I'd imagined. I remember that afternoon vividly, the weak winter sunlight spilling through the kitchen window as I went still before my laptop, my hands cold. With a single click, the trust one had built over 14 years of marriage shattered to dust. Ethan's trust fund, the one Blake and I had contributed to since he was a year old, now showed a balance of zero. The transaction history revealed the entire $150,000 had been transferred to an unfamiliar account, then withdrawn in cash within hours. My vision blurred. I had to blink repeatedly to read the number. I called the bank immediately. This must be a mistake. My husband would never. The employee's voice was polite but detached. Mrs. Carter, Mr. Blake Carter is a co-trustee. By law, he has the authority to sign and execute transactions. I gripped the chair tightly, trying to keep my voice steady. But this money is for my son's treatment. Can't. I'm very sorry, ma'am, but the transaction is entirely legal on paper. If you have concerns about how it's being used, you should consult an attorney. Old instincts from my years as a financial data analyst in a federal anti-laundering program kicked in. The phone slipped from my hand onto the table without me realizing it. My ears rang, my mind went blank. Despite our disagreements, I had never imagined Blake would touch that money. The money that paid for every physical therapy session, helping Ethan learn to place his weaker foot on the floor without wobbling. For every speech therapy hour that helped him speak more clearly without pausing to find words. For every small but vital piece of equipment like the lightweight braces that let him walk without tiring after a few steps. The sound of small footsteps on the wooden floor pulled me back. Ethan stood in the doorway, holding a glass of milk with both hands, his left hand still trembling slightly when lifting anything heavier than a book. His messy brown hair partially covered his bright eyes, now filled with curiosity. Mom, is Dad going to Florida with the blonde lady? I looked up sharply. Who told you that? Nobody. I saw it on my iPad. A picture of Dad hugging a blonde lady, standing in front of a white house with the ocean behind it. Ethan's old iPad was for watching cartoons or playing skill-building games. Blake sometimes borrowed it, saying he was installing new therapy apps. I never thought he'd be careless enough to leave anything revealing. I took the iPad from Ethan and opened the photo library. Amid the pictures of him practicing on the balance beam, each step slow but steady, was a series of unfamiliar shots. Blake in a white shirt, his arm around the waist of a slender young woman with blonde hair in a floral dress. Behind them stood a 2-story white house with a balcony facing the sea. The late afternoon light washed over everything, the kind you see on postcards of happiness, but not meant for me and my son. When did you see this? Yesterday. Dad borrowed the iPad for something, then left it on the table. I opened it to play a game and found it. Ethan spoke as if it were nothing unusual, though a trace of confusion lingered in his voice. I gently brushed his hair. Thank you for telling me, sweetheart. Now go upstairs and do your homework. When Ethan was gone, I studied the photos. They had been taken 3 weeks ago, right when Blake claimed he had to be in Portland, overseeing an urgent project. Another shot clearly showed the house number. Yet another captured the two of them at a seaside cafe, heads leaning close together. I set the iPad down, forcing a deep breath to push back the wave of nausea. What had Blake used our son's money for? To buy a house? To support this woman? Or both? My phone buzzed. A text from Blake. I'll be home late. Don't wait for dinner. I stared at the short line of text, a mix of unfamiliarity and bitter familiarity tightening in my chest. This was the man who had held me in the delivery room, wiping my sweat as I fought to bring Ethan into the world. The man who had sat all night in the hospital when our son was on a ventilator. The man who had smiled when Ethan ran 3 consecutive steps without holding my hand for the first time. And now, the same man had vanished with our son's money, smiling in another woman's arms on a Florida beach. I pulled my laptop closer and checked every account. The joint savings had barely over $200. The spending account was empty. My credit card, under my name, was maxed out, every transaction in the last 3 weeks tied to restaurants, hotels, and furniture stores, most of them in Florida. I logged into the bank's website trying to find a way to freeze the card. When the representative asked why, all I could say was, "My husband may be using money without my permission." "I'm sorry, ma'am. If the card is jointly held, we can't freeze it without both signatures." I closed the laptop, feeling as if the kitchen walls were pressing in on me. Ethan's voice echoed again. Dad's going to Florida with the blonde lady. Florida. The blonde lady. The oceanfront house. All the pieces fit together, forming a picture I didn't want to face, but couldn't deny. The sound of the door opening startled me. Ethan peeked into the kitchen. Mom, I finished my math. Can I watch TV? I gave him a tired smile. Sure, but only for half an hour. When he turned away, I took my phone and snapped pictures of every image on the iPad, saving them to a secure drive. If what I suspected was true, this would be my first piece of evidence. And deep down, beneath the anger and hurt, something else began to take root. A cold, clear calculation, and the single question that mattered most. If Blake thought I would stand by and watch him take everything, did he have any idea he had chosen the wrong woman to betray? It took me nearly half an hour to steady myself enough to dial my in-laws. Part of me still hoped that, despite everything crumbling, at least they would stand with me and Ethan. The phone rang longer than usual before Blake's mother answered. Her tone was steady, not the slightest bit unsettled when I told her Blake had emptied Ethan's trust fund and disappeared. You need to understand, Remy. Men have their own needs, she said lightly as if discussing the weather. Needs? Are you talking about him taking his own son's medical fund to do something with another woman? She was silent for a few seconds before replying. Blake's under a lot of pressure. That fund, you'll earn it back. But a man, when cornered, will find a way to breathe. It felt like she had slapped me. I forced my voice to stay steady. This isn't about breathing or pressure. This is betrayal and theft from his own child. She didn't argue. She simply said she couldn't interfere in a husband and wife matter, and ended the call. I set the phone down, my chest heavy as stone. That was when I realized Ethan and I were completely on our own. 2 days later, I found an envelope in the mailbox. Inside was a notice from our landlord. Rent was 3 months overdue. I froze, reading the line over and over. Lease termination if payment is not made within 14 days. I had been sending rent to Blake every month, transferring it to the account he gave me, which meant that for the last 3 months he had been pocketing the rent money I believed was being paid. That night, I combed through emails and bank statements, pulling every transfer record. They were all there, clear and orderly. Except none of them had ever gone to the landlord's account. I didn't know if I was angrier about losing the money or about realizing how cleanly I'd been deceived. As if another layer of safety had been stripped away, the next morning I uncovered yet another blow. Logging into Ethan's health insurance portal to download his therapy records for an upcoming doctor's appointment, I was met with the message: access denied, secondary verification required. I tried every old password, but each attempt failed. After several calls, the insurance representative explained that the holder of the verification code was Blake, and they couldn't release it without his consent. But I'm his mother, his primary caregiver. My son needs weekly therapy. I tried to explain. I understand, ma'am, but according to our records, Mr. Carter is the primary account holder and keeper of the security code. We must follow protocol. I hung up, my hands shaking. For a moment, I felt as though I were standing in the middle of an ocean, each wave sweeping away something else. Money, housing, medical access, and the fragile sense of safety I had left. Ethan walked into the kitchen as I sat at the table. He still moved carefully, his right hand brushing the edge of the chair for balance. Mom, do I need to bring the insurance papers to my therapist? He asked, eyes expectant. I forced a smile. Don't worry, sweetheart. I'll take care of it. But inside, I knew I no longer had access to those documents. The helplessness felt like holding onto my child yet still letting him slip away. That night, after putting Ethan to bed, I sat alone in the living room. The house was silent, the hum of the heater the only sound. I thought about everything Blake had done, not just taking money but systematically stripping away every tool I had to protect our son. I opened the file cabinet, spreading every financial and medical document across the table. In the yellow glow of the lamp, they looked like evidence in a case where I was both witness and victim. Every line, every number felt like another cut to the trust that had once existed. And I knew that if I wanted to keep Ethan safe, I couldn't sit here and wait. I needed to take back control, before Blake erased anything else. For many nights I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to the ticking clock, replaying every image and word from Blake. From his evasive glances when I asked about work, to the smile beside the blonde woman in the photo on Ethan's iPad. I knew I needed answers, and more importantly, I needed proof. One Thursday night after Ethan was asleep, I went into Blake's old office. The small room where he once worked at a dark wooden desk now held only a few cardboard boxes and a dust-covered desktop computer. I meant to search for anything related to insurance and bank accounts, but my eyes stopped at the bottom drawer. Inside was a small plastic container, Ethan's old vitamin box from the months after his muscle surgery. The lid was slightly loose, and when I opened it, a silver USB drive lay inside. My pulse kicked up. Blake was meticulous to the point of paranoia. If he hid this here, it was not something ordinary. I plugged the USB into the old computer. After a few seconds, the screen filled with folders. The first one, labeled Contracts, contained dozens of PDF files, many signed B. Carter, alongside a name I didn't recognize, Calvin Rhodes. I opened one at random, and the words that appeared made my skin crawl. It was an investment contract for a string of coastal real estate projects, but a small note at the bottom revealed that the investment funds came from unidentified private sources. I continued opening the other folders. The emails folder contained copies of exchanges between Blake and Calvin. In one email dated less than 2 months ago, Calvin wrote, "The transfer from the trust fund has arrived. Phase 1 is starting right on schedule. Don't let her know until everything is complete." My throat tightened. Trust fund? No one had to tell me they were talking about the money Ethan was supposed to use for years of therapy and assistive equipment. I scrolled down and kept reading. There were exchanges about blurring the money trail, using shell companies to move capital between international accounts. The name Calvin Rhodes appeared repeatedly, alongside attachments of doctored financial reports. That name jogged a memory of a news piece from a few years back. Calvin had once been investigated for laundering money through a chain of luxury real estate projects in Miami. He escaped charges for lack of evidence, but many of his partners at the time went bankrupt or lost everything. I froze at the screen, the pieces clicking into place. Blake hadn't only betrayed me emotionally. He had put his own son's money into the hands of a man with a deeply tainted past. And that meant, if the project collapsed or was investigated, the money would be gone entirely, and might even drag me and Ethan into legal trouble. I opened an Excel file titled Investor List. Inside was a list of individual investors, many with notes marked Anonymous. Next to the name Blake Carter, the note read, Trust Fund, Child with CP. They had even listed Ethan's medical condition as a way to identify the source of the money. I clenched my fists, a mix of fury and grief surging through me. Blake had turned his own son into a footnote in a filthy spreadsheet. Beyond the contracts and emails, the last folder, labeled Properties, held images and detailed drawings of the investments. When I clicked on one photo, I recognized it instantly. It was the same white beachfront house from the pictures on Ethan's iPad. The note beneath the image read, Phase 1, property for client meetings/personal stay, Florida coast. This wasn't an investment property. It was the place where Blake and that woman met and enjoyed themselves, on money that should have belonged to our son. I leaned back in my chair, my mind a storm. Part of me wanted to shut the laptop, throw the USB away and pretend I didn't know. But the other part, sharper, more clear-headed, knew this was the only lead I had to turn the situation around. I copied all the data onto my personal drive, layering multiple passwords. Then I carefully placed the USB back in the pillbox and returned it to its exact spot so Blake wouldn't suspect a thing. That night, when I went into Ethan's room to pull the blanket over him, I stood there looking at his small sleeping face. His legs were bent slightly as they always were, and his left arm twitched as he shifted. Familiar signs of the mild cerebral palsy we had been working through every day. I knew that if I stayed silent, his future wouldn't just be harder. It could be destroyed entirely. I smoothed his soft hair and whispered like a promise, I will get it all back for you, Ethan. And this time I won't let anyone take it away again. A week later, while I was still gathering more data from the USB and trying to contact a lawyer, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Evelyn, Blake's sister. Her voice was soft, almost overly sweet. Remy, we need to talk. The family thinks it would be best if you signed over custody of Ethan. I stayed still for a few seconds, making sure I'd heard right. Excuse me? You know your financial situation. Ethan needs more than you can provide. Blake is settling down. If Ethan stays with him, he'll have full care, government benefits, a better environment. I let out a dry laugh. My voice didn't shake, but inside, every muscle tightened. Whose idea was this? Blake's? Or Calvin Rhodes? On the other end, Evelyn hesitated for a beat, then changed the subject. Just think about it. Tomorrow we'll meet at the family's attorney's office, sign it, and everyone can move on. I agreed immediately, catching her off guard. Fine. Send me the address and time. I'll be there. After hanging up, I sat for a long while. I was certain this wasn't just the Blake family's idea. It was part of a larger plan. Gain custody to access federal disability benefits and insurance payouts. With Calvin behind it, that money would be funneled into laundering schemes in no time. That evening, after putting Ethan to bed, I opened my laptop. The screen lit up with the folders I'd saved from the USB. I searched for an email between Blake and Calvin. There it was, Calvin writing. If you secure legal custody, we'll have a long-term benefit stream, no worries about cash flow. Below it was a list of projected government benefits and insurance payouts, estimated at hundreds of thousands of dollars over the next decade. I saved everything, then called Marianne, an old classmate who now worked as a family lawyer in Tacoma. I think they're setting a trap for me, I said bluntly, and I need to trap them first. Marianne was silent for a few seconds, then told me to explain everything. When I finished, her voice was firm. Don't decline the meeting. Go, but be prepared. We'll make them expose their own plan. The next morning, I called Ethan's therapy clinic, casually asking for copies of all his recent medical records. Luckily, a friendly technician agreed to print me a full set, just to be safe. I wanted them on hand, knowing they'd use the "she can't provide enough care" argument to pressure me. Next, I went to see Diane, a longtime friend who now serves as a federal agent in a financial crimes unit. I showed her the contract and the emails between Blake and Calvin. Diane glanced through them and said, "This is solid gold. If they dare take this to court, he's finished." We built a checklist together. The questions I'd ask if the meeting turned into a soft interrogation, and the pieces of evidence I could subtly present to rattle them. On the day of the meeting, I chose a simple but strong navy suit. When I walked into the attorney's office the Blake family had hired, I saw Evelyn, Blake's mother, and a man I didn't recognize already seated. The man stood to shake my hand. "I'm Mr. Harlan, the family's legal representative." On the table was an open manila folder. I sat down, quietly placing my own document bag beside me. Harlan began, "We're here to discuss Ethan's best interests. As you know, Blake has a plan for long-term stability while your financial situation." I cut in, calm but firm. "Long-term stability, meaning living in Florida in a house bought with my son's trust fund, funded by a man previously investigated for money laundering?" The air in the room shifted instantly. Evelyn frowned. "Remy, don't turn this into a fight." "I'm not turning it into anything. I'm asking a question." I took out a copy of the contract signed by Blake and Calvin and set it on the table. "This is the investment agreement from Ethan's trust fund. I also have an email from Calvin to Blake detailing the plan to use federal disability benefits if they won custody." Harlan tried to dismiss it. "There's nothing to confirm the authenticity of these documents." Diane, present as the investigating agent, spoke up from the corner where she'd been sitting quietly. "These documents have been signature verified and source authenticated. Trust me, if needed, we'll deliver them straight to the state prosecutor's office." The room went silent. Evelyn looked at me, her expression a mix of anger and surprise. And for the first time since this began, I didn't feel like I was on the defensive anymore. I laced my fingers on the table, my voice steady. "Back to the point. I will not sign any document surrendering custody of Ethan. And if anyone tries to use my son's health condition for profit, I will make sure it's brought to light, both in public and in court." No one responded. The only sound was paper rustling as Harlan closed the folder. But I knew that was enough for them to understand the game had changed. Blake entered the meeting nearly 10 minutes late. He wore his familiar pale blue shirt, his tie slightly askew, but his face was nothing like the husband I had once known. There was something cold, almost venomous, in his eyes when he looked at me. "Remy, I hear you wanted to meet." I didn't answer immediately, instead shifting my chair aside to reveal Diane sitting directly across from him. Blake froze for a moment, scanning her as if trying to place where he'd seen her. Diane gave a polite smile, but her eyes were sharp as blades. "Hello, Mr. Porter. I'm Diane Porter. We haven't officially met, but I'm sure you'll know me after today." I saw Blake's jaw tighten. He sat down, buttoning his jacket, forcing a calm tone. "This is a family matter. I don't see why there's an outsider here." "An outsider?" I cut in, placing a thick folder on the table. "You might find her relevant when you learn Diane is a federal agent specializing in financial crimes." Blake's eyes flicked toward Evelyn and Harlan as if searching for backup. But before they could speak, I opened the folder, sliding out neatly clipped documents. "Besides working at the hospital, do you still remember what I did before we got married?" I asked, my voice even and deliberate. "I was a financial data analyst for the U.S. Treasury Department in a special program monitoring money laundering transactions." I angled the folder toward him. The first page was a detailed breakdown of transactions. Transfers from Ethan's trust fund to a shell account, then to Rhodes Development LLC, then split and moved through multiple international accounts. The arrows and dates were clearly marked. "This is the complete trail of the $150,000 from our son's fund," I said, locking eyes with Blake. "Along with a copy of the investment contract with Calvin Rhodes, a man once investigated for money laundering." Blake reached out to flip the page, but only a few seconds later he set the papers down on the table, forcing a faint smile. "You don't know what you're talking about. These documents have been verified," Diane cut in, pulling a sealed envelope from her briefcase. "Your signature on the contract is a perfect match with the one on your legal records. And this," she pulled out another sheet, "is proof you forged Remy's signature to withdraw an additional $25,000 from the joint savings account." Blake turned toward Harlan, about to speak, but Diane continued. "We've also obtained emails between you and Rhodes discussing how to win custody of Ethan to access federal benefits. Everything has been forwarded to the U.S. Attorney's Office." I kept my voice steady. "You thought I didn't know anything. You thought I'd sit quietly and sign whatever papers they handed me. But you forgot. Before I became your wife, I spent years tracking people far better at hiding financial trails than you are." Diane opened a second briefcase and set 3 thick envelopes on the table. "These are search and seizure warrants, signed by a judge this morning. Every account in your name and every asset purchased with laundered funds will be frozen, including the Florida house." Evelyn shot to her feet. "You can't do that. That house was bought with the trust fund of a child with a disability," Diane said, locking eyes with her. "We not only can, but we will." Blake leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from anger to unease. I noticed his hand tremble slightly, as if he were realizing for the first time that he was cornered. "Remy," he tried, lowering his voice. "Can we talk alone?" I shook my head. "No. From now on, everything will be said openly. And you'll answer to the court, not to me." Harlan murmured something in Blake's ear, but I knew it was too late. Once Diane had put the search warrants on the table, the game had changed. I gathered my documents and slipped them neatly into my bag. When I stood, I looked straight at Blake one last time. "You took from Ethan something that can't be measured in money, trust and safety. Money can be recovered. Trust cannot." Diane signaled to 2 colleagues to enter, their federal agent IDs clearly visible. One moved toward Blake, reading him his rights while the other collected his phone and laptop. I turned and walked out of the conference room. Behind me came the rustle of papers, the scrape of chairs, and Diane's clear voice. "From now on, all communication will go through your attorney and the investigating agency." Stepping outside, I drew in a deep breath. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had regained part of the control I'd lost. But deep down, I knew this battle was only beginning. Blake was led into the interrogation room, the marks from the cuffs still visible on his wrists. When he saw me, he froze briefly, something flickering between pleading and anger in his eyes. "Remy," his voice was hoarse, "everything I did was to give our son a better future. You have to believe me." I stayed silent. Diane stood beside me, holding a small recorder. She pressed the button and Blake's voice filled the room, cold and deliberate. "If Remy loses custody, the benefits will be ours." The sound echoed off the walls. Blake turned to Diane, then back to me, his lips parting as if to deny it, but no excuse came out. "A better future?" I repeated quietly, my voice dropping. Or a future where you and Calvin lived comfortably on that money while my son was left with nothing? I pulled out the divorce papers Marianne had prepared, signing them in front of him. The ink spread across the page, each stroke severing the last tie to this man. Blake exhaled sharply but said nothing more. Maybe he knew that any justification now would only make him look smaller. 2 days later, news of Calvin Rhodes's arrest was everywhere. Photos showed him being led out of a Miami building, head down, hands cuffed behind his back. A text from Diane arrived at the same time he talked. Client list is under review. I hadn't planned to care, until Diane called me directly. Remy, you need to stay calm. There's a name on that list that you'll recognize immediately. I heard Diane flipping pages. Helen Ward. Helen Ward, Ethan's lead therapist for the past 3 years. The one who'd witnessed every tiny but precious step forward. The woman I had trusted completely, even giving her a key to our apartment so she could work with Ethan when I was on night shifts. That's impossible, I whispered. He said she referred several parents with large trust funds to him in exchange for broker fees, disguised as transfers from a shell company. There's evidence she co-signed investment papers and even held accounts offshore. I pressed a hand to my forehead, a mix of shock and a fresh sting of betrayal. Every session, every word of encouragement she'd given Ethan, were they genuine or part of a plan to get close to his money? That evening I went through every invoice and email from Helen. Some therapy fees had been paid outside the insurance system, deposited directly into her personal account. Then I found an old email. Helen had sent me a link to an article on investing to grow disability care funds. The link led to a website owned by a company under Calvin's name. Thinking back, I realized Helen had subtly suggested making the trust fund work harder for Ethan. At the time, I dismissed it, not willing to take risks. But Blake was different. He'd easily fallen for promises of high returns and absolute safety. Now it was clear. Calvin wasn't only hunting for investors in real estate. He was targeting parents desperate to secure lifelong care for their children. Helen was the perfect conduit, a trusted face to parents, but in reality, a link in the chain. The next morning, I went to the therapy center with Ethan. Helen still wore her familiar white coat, smiling gently as she greeted him. But this time I didn't smile back. I stood in the doorway, watching her kneel to tie Ethan's shoelaces. Ethan, you're taking the day off, I said evenly. Helen looked up, slightly confused. Is something wrong, Remy? I stepped in and placed an envelope on her desk. Inside were copies of emails, contracts, and a court summons. I think you know what this is. The color drained from Helen's face. She glanced at the papers, lips pressed tight. Remy, I can explain. No need, I cut her off. I've heard enough explanations from one trader. I don't need another. I took Ethan's hand and walked out. As we left, his small fingers tightened around mine, a quiet sign of understanding. That afternoon, Diane called with an update. Helen had been taken in for questioning. Calvin had detailed her role, backed by financial evidence. With her testimony on record, Blake's case became even harder to salvage. It proved he had willingly participated in a criminal network, not been dragged into it as he once claimed. I sat by the window watching Ethan patiently build a tower of Lego bricks. He was as focused and persistent as always, seemingly untouched by the storm around us. But I knew that to keep him this way I had to stay strong. Blake had lost everything, and people like Calvin and Helen would face their reckoning. But I still had Ethan. And he was the only reason I could not and would not fall in this fight. The day the court declared I had full custody of Ethan, I could hardly believe what I'd just heard. The judge went on to state that all misappropriated assets would be returned to me, along with compensation from the insurance company for the damages my son and I had suffered. As we left the courtroom, Ethan held my hand tightly. He didn't understand everything, but the relief in his eyes was enough to tell me every effort I'd made had been worth it. In the days that followed, I began putting our lives back together. I ended our lease on the old apartment and moved into a small house near a park, where the stone-paved paths would let Ethan practice walking without traffic getting in the way. In the living room, I set up a large table covered in papers. It became the command center for Guardian Path, the nonprofit I had been envisioning. Guardian Path was born from a simple idea. No parent should ever go through what I went through. I wanted to help them protect their finances, understand their legal rights, and have a voice for their children in any circumstance. Our first meeting had only 4 people. Me, Diane, a lawyer specializing in children's rights, and a single mother of a hearing-impaired child. We sat around the table drinking coffee and sharing stories no one else had wanted to hear. Diane looked at me half joking, half serious. "You didn't survive, Remy. You're leading the way." Alongside building Guardian Path, I kept Ethan's therapy schedule a priority. After what happened with Helen, I found a new team of transparent, dedicated specialists who used a combination of movement, communication, and music therapy. One afternoon, I stood in the doorway of the therapy room, watching Ethan thread colored beads, his lips moving as he counted in rhythm. He smiled when he finished and turned to find me. I gave him a thumbs up, my heart warming. Compared to a year ago, he had made remarkable progress, not only in skills but in confidence. 3 months later, I received an invitation to speak at the National Child Protection Conference in Washington, D.C. At first, I hesitated. I had never stood in front of hundreds of people to tell my story. But then I thought of the parents sitting somewhere, surrounded by legal paperwork and fear for their child's future. If I stayed silent, they might never know there was still a way forward. On the day of the conference, I wore a deep navy suit with a key-shaped pin, the new symbol of Guardian Path. As I stepped up to the podium, the lights were bright enough to make me squint, but the wave of applause pushed me forward. I began with Ethan's story, a boy born with physical challenges, whose every step forward was worth more than any amount of money. Then I told my own journey, from a night shift nurse, to confronting betrayal, and finally to finding a way to turn pain into action. When I spoke about Guardian Path, I saw some people nodding, others wiping away tears. I ended with a simple sentence: we can't protect our children from every storm, but we can teach them where to find shelter, and give them the key to open the door. The applause went on and on. In that moment, I knew I had chosen the right path. That night, back in my hotel room, I called Ethan on video. He proudly showed me the Lego castle he had just built and asked when I would be home. I promised it would be only a few more days. Before hanging up, he tilted his head and asked, "Mom, did you help someone today?" "Yes, sweetheart. I did. And I'll help many more." One evening, Ethan and I sat on the sofa, the warm yellow light falling across the soft rug. I had just closed his picture book when he tilted his head, his brown eyes curious. "You won, didn't you?" he asked softly, as if confirming something he had believed all along. I smiled gently, brushing his soft hair. "It's not about winning or losing, Ethan. I only took back what belonged to you." He rested his head on my shoulder. Just a small gesture, but I knew he felt safe. Not because I had won against someone, but because I had protected what mattered most. A few weeks later, Guardian Path's new office officially opened. It was a 2-story building on the corner of a quiet street, with maple trees out front turning deep red for autumn. A wooden sign carved with the key logo hung above the entrance, beneath the words, "Protecting families, securing futures." That morning, as I was arranging my desk, I looked out the wide window and saw dozens of parents chatting while waiting to register. Some carried small children, others stood beside teenagers in wheelchairs or with crutches. Their faces showed fatigue but also a glimmer of hope. Diane walked in holding a hot coffee and a new stack of files. "This is only day 1. You ready for a whole waiting list?" she teased. "I've been ready for a long time, Diane. I just needed a push to start." She looked at me, her expression softening. "That push, it might have hurt, but look where it brought you." Our first intake session was in a small conference room upstairs. I sat across from each family, listening to their stories. A young mother's hands trembled as she described how relatives had taken advantage of her child's benefits. A single father juggled 3 jobs to cover therapy costs. With each word, I saw my past self, confused, scared, and not knowing where to begin. I opened my folder, showing them how to set up a trust fund, demand transparent financial reports from organizations, and keep records so every transaction related to their child had proof. One middle-aged woman gripped my hand tightly before leaving. "Thank you for being here." Her words brought back memories of long nights when I'd sat alone, searching the internet for answers and feeling abandoned. Back then, I had wished someone would walk in, put a hand on my shoulder, and say, "I understand. And I know what to do." Late in the afternoon, as the office grew quiet, I stood by the window watching cars leave the lot. The sunset stretched across the street, bathing everything in warm orange. In that moment I heard Blake's words from long ago. I'll take our son's future from you. What Blake didn't know was that when he tried to take everything, he had unknowingly given me something stronger than loss. A reason to fight. Now that reason wasn't just for Ethan. It was for thousands of other children and for the parents fighting to stay standing in the storm. I knew I would keep walking this path, not for revenge but for protection. When I look back, I don't only see the losses. I see the hands that reached for me when I thought I would fall. Maybe real strength doesn't come from standing alone, but from daring to open up so we can stand together. My story is just one among countless others. About family, love, and the determination to protect what we believe is right. And I believe that somewhere out there, people are still quietly fighting for their children, their happiness, and their peace. What about you? What do you think about this journey? About how a mother turned pain into the drive to change not only her life but the lives of others. If you want to keep hearing meaningful stories about family, love, and the journey to reclaim self-worth, follow the channel so we can meet again in the next story. Because who knows, maybe you'll find a piece of yourself in it.